had been involved in a few projects on teacher evaluation and teacher assessment at ETS. One was Praxis 3 and one was National Board. And we all of us discovered that everybody who touched either of those systems, and they were very different from the other, obviously, right? One was for licensing of first-year teachers, a continuing license. The National Board was for advanced certification of experience, different purposes, different methodologies. Everything about them different, except everybody who ever was involved with either of them found them valuable. And I was the only person at ETS who actually worked on both of them, which I suppose means I was the only person on the planet who worked on both of them. And I couldn't help but notice that they had one thing in common. Everything about them was different, but one thing in common, and that was they had clear standards of practice. They had clear definition, a clear answer to the question of what do we mean by good teaching. And so at the time when that work was going on, it was early days, it never occurred to me anybody would ever use, I mean, in those days, very few people were doing National Board, and Praxis 3 basically fizzled after Ohio was the only state who ever really used it. And I thought, well, what if, how many people ever have advantage of these? Maybe 5% of teachers? What about the other 95%? If this is good to have, why would we not offer it for everyone? And so that was what generated my interest in writing the framework for teaching, which I then did. And as just because I thought it ought to be done. And so I drew on the research that we had done for Praxis 3 and some of the work from the National Board, and updated those and so on. So that's what resulted in the framework. And I'll talk a little bit about that and how it's evolved since then, by the way, which is relevant. So here we are, and I'd like to just offer a few perspectives in an hour, what does someone have, on this important topic. I will just also say one other thing in starting, and that is I've discovered that I've become a noun. I'm not really a person anymore. And actually, what's worse, I've become a verb. And passive verb. Like, we've been Danielson. But we are in a new place. And I have to tell you, I travel a lot and internationally. We're the only country in the world who's doing this. Just so you know, around teacher evaluation and teacher, it's just, do with that as you like, and you probably know it as well as I do, but we're the only country who's doing this. Anyhow, here we go. So, it began, all this, a couple years ago, with the report, which you, I'm sure, remember, the Widget Effect report, the new teacher project, kicked it off. And the slide on the left shows the results. What they did was survey teacher evaluation practices in a number of school districts around the country, large ones, and they found, and this is Akron and Chicago, the size of those circles are the number, and therefore, of course, percentages of teachers whose performance was judged to be at different levels. And the vast majority were at the top of whatever the scale was, superior or outstanding or whatever, down to much smaller numbers, in some cases vanishingly small and literally zero, judged to be unsatisfactory. Which would be good news if it were true. Right? And of course we don't know for sure it's not true, but in those same places there are children who are not learning to read or do anything else. And so it's probably not quite true. And granted, there are a number of factors that contribute to student learning, there's no doubt about that, but the quality of teaching is key, and so it's probably not true. And now that report had probably greater influence than any other single thing on the race to the top competition. And it's amazing what happens when you put $4 billion on the table. It gets people's attention, right? And in order for states to even apply for that money, they had to commit to revamping their systems of teacher evaluation. And most of them did it for it. And they had it, they didn't have to, but they did in many cases. They did it in a hurry. And that all by itself has created some of difficulties that practitioners are having right now in implementing the policies that were, put in statute, basically. But what they also found, and this was a further analysis of the data from Los Angeles. What they discovered was that not only was teacher evaluation not working for students, it wasn't fair to teachers. And so that big circle represents all the teachers in LA. The blue part of the circle, which is almost all of them, are the teachers in Los Angeles whose teaching was judged to be at the satisfactory level or above. Almost everybody. Tiny little yellow sliver are the unsatisfactory. If you pull those out and look at those over on the right, the green chartreuse part of that circle are the teachers in LA whose own performance was judged to be unsatisfactory, but whose students outperformed the students of the teachers in the blue. And so, well, that got people's attention also. And so we thought, well, heck, there's a positive way to look at this and say, well, it's a low bar. We can surely do better than this. And furthermore, we need to. So now let's remember why we're doing this. Why do we, and you said, well, we want to evaluate teacher effectiveness because we have laws. Okay, then why do we have laws, other than to get federal money? Well, the first reason is to ensure quality. And let's just be really clear about this. We're public schools, public institutions taking public money. The public has a right to expect good teaching, period. Right? There's really not anything more to say about it. Now, you might even say it's more dramatic in private schools. They take people's money directly. It's not even mediated through the tax system. But the principle is the same. It's other people's money, and we are doing what is arguably the most important work there is, which is educating the children. And so I mean, it's that I think is non-negotiable. But we, as educators, have a second purpose as well, which is to promote professional learning. Now, when I say this, and I would presume it's the same with you, I don't say this because I think teaching is of poor quality and has to be fixed. That's not it actually at all. It's that teaching is so hard that it's never perfect. And almost by definition, no matter how good a lesson is, it could always be a bit better, which means that, in my view, it's part of the professional obligation of every teacher, as any other professional, to be engaged in a career-long quest to improve practice. And this also seems to me a sort of a no-brainer. And so now, you might look at these, and I do, and say, well, okay, we do want to do both of these things, but they're very different kinds of things. And I agree with that. That is, a system to ensure quality is going to be rigorous and valid and reliable and defensible, professionally defensible, maybe even legally defensible, right? I mean, these are a lot of hard-sounding things. Whereas a system to promote learning is likely to be more collegial, more collaborative, sort of soft. So how do we combine them? And we've tried, of course, in schools by enhancing the skills of the people who do the evaluating through coaching and supervision and stuff, and those are fine. I don't think they're sufficient. I think we need to do it in the design of the systems themselves. And I'll explain a bit, another sentence or two on that later when I have another diagram to show you. But let's just stick with the quality assurance part for a moment, and let's remember that there are two dimensions going on here, and there are many of you in this room who are far more expert in some of this than I am. But there are two dimensions. One is rigor, and the other is level of stakes, like how consequential are the decisions. And so when you have two dimensions, of course, you have four quadrants, and we can populate the quadrants with a few examples. And National Board of Praxis 3, the two systems that I sort of cut my teeth on, would be high stakes and rigorous. And of course, there are a lot of low stakes things. The teacher center, Santa Cruz mentoring model is also pretty rigorous. Low stakes, though, of course, it's mentoring. And over in the bottom left are virtually all traditional evaluation systems and, of course, most informal mentoring programs. The ones I worry about, and I imagine you would be as well, are the ones in the lower right-hand right quadrant. That is high stakes and low rigor. And I do worry that if we don't get this right, that's where we're going to be. That's where we're going to be. So, what does it mean to get it right? Well, the first bunch of stuff has to do just with technical defensibility. And this is where I would just defer to some of your expertise. I mean, I know enough about this to be dangerous, but I will say just a couple things. A clear definition of practice is obvious. You know, you can't measure something you haven't defined. And I will say too that in the years since my framework was first published and it's been used in increasingly high stakes environments, I found I had to revise, sort of update it to make it sort of stronger and make the language more clearly differentiated from one level to the next and so on. And just tighten it up. And that's because initially I wasn't really thinking about that and it wasn't needed, but it is now. You want to have a validated instrument, and Stephen mentioned that one of the consequences of the MET study was that my instrument and the others that were used were found to be valid. Not really strong signals of teacher quality, but definitely positive and significant. And in the case of the framework, and I don't know about the other instruments that were used, we found that the correlations, the predictive validity of the framework for teaching on the assessments that they didn't do them with all students, but the more complex assessments was higher. The correlations were higher. I was very pleased to see that because those assessments are more like what we're going to be getting with the Common Core than the ones they use for the bulk of the study. So that I can take to be good news, but the jury's still out on that. We don't really have large-scale studies yet. The issue of the evaluators is not trivial. Not trivial. You know, it's of course you need trained evaluators. I would argue you need certified evaluators. People are making consequential decisions, and you know you can't get a driver's license without demonstrating you can do it. Why should you be able to make consequential decisions about people's careers and their salaries and their futures without demonstrating you can do it? And one of the outgrowths of the MET study was exactly on this point. And because in order to even do that study, we had to train and certify observers. Otherwise, you wouldn't know, you couldn't trust your data, right? And so we developed an online training and certification program for the assessors, the observers in the MET study. And then after that was finished, and TeachGate was the company that did all the video capture and all of the online design and all of the work really. And ETS was an important partner there, the psychometric partner, but TeachGate did all the online work. And so we continued that partnership after the MET study was over. That is me and ETS and TeachGate, and created an online training and certification program for observers for the framework, and just so it's now publicly available. We couldn't use anything directly from the MET study, any of the videos, for example, because they were just so we did it all over again, and actually got it a little bit better, but a slightly better quality videos for one thing. So in any case, and then of course psychometric validity of the system itself, and then of course you need to be professionally defensible. And as one of my colleagues says, we're not going to fire our way to Finland. I mean, some of the laws, if you read them, now they're somewhat varied across the country, but many of them appear to be written by people who believe that if you just fire the least effective 6% of teachers, we'll be good to go. And I don't know where that sort of line of reasoning came from. It doesn't pass the common sense test as far as I'm concerned. Because, okay, so you have 6% fewer teachers, and you're going to fill those slots with brilliant teaching. What's the next step then after you do the firing? None of it makes sense to me. So in any case, So you need the systems, and I made this point earlier, that actually promote learning. So, okay. So you have to establish validity. We did this, and I won't belabor this point. A couple of big studies, though. The Chicago, I've mentioned that study. The Chicago study was prior. That was done in Chicago, obviously, by CCSR, Chicago Consortium for School Research, affiliated with the University of Chicago. They're very, I had not known them before. They took on this study. I didn't ask them to, but I have to just tell you that when a group like that comes to me, or the Gates Foundation, in the case of the Met study, says, "We'd like to do this big study. Can we use your framework?" I took a deep breath and actually held it for a few years and said, "Sure, sure, I'd be honored." But until the results came out, I was nervous because I had absolutely no input into the design of the study, the conduct, none of it. And I just had to hold my breath and hope it came out. The Chicago study did. It was, it involved 100 schools with paired observations by principals and teachers on special assignment. And they observed the same lesson together, and then came out and each assessed it independently and sent in their results to the researchers. And then the principal conducted the conversation with the teacher as they would normally. And the researchers were able to, first of all, see how well these two independent observers agreed with each other. And they found, incidentally, the principals tend to be a bit more lenient than the external observers, which is interesting to have that borne out, that sort of prediction borne out. But they found in general high correlations and high correlations with student learning. They also had value-added data on student learning. But the other big finding from the Chicago study was that they also did both some qualitative research as well. And they interviewed and did focus groups and did surveys of everybody involved. All of the 100% of the teachers found the process valuable, which I found very gratifying, obviously, and a little bit surprising. But these surveys were done anonymously, so they could be honest. But here's what they liked about it most. They had really good conversations with their principals, which they sort of said they never really had before. And the principals said the same thing, actually. They valued it, and what they valued was the conversations. But in the principal's case, they also said, but we don't feel they didn't feel confident that they had enough training to do that part well. And I can imagine that's true. I have an administrative credential. I'm sure I took a course on supervision and instruction. I couldn't tell you a thing that was in it. There was nothing about how to have conversations. And I hope in your programs you do include that in the administrative certification program, because it's a really important, it's why you have the observations, so you can have a good conversation, and a meaningful one, and one that's productive and valuable for the teacher. So in any case, that was a really important finding out of the Chicago study. The Cincinnati study, which I won't spend much time on, what they found, though, with the big takeaway there, was that the quality of teaching continued to improve. It improved during the year teachers were evaluated. And in Cincinnati at the time, they were not evaluated every year. It was every 5 years. So the quality of teaching improved in the year they were being evaluated and continued to improve in the following years, subsequent years, which was an astonishing and very encouraging finding, I thought. Because what that suggested is that teachers would get with the program, like look at the instrument and say, oh, right, this is what I'm going to be evaluated on, I guess I'm going to do some of these things. And then they would do them and they find them effective and they keep doing them. And hopefully get better at it. So that was a very interesting study. Not a huge number involved, and it's available, by the way, on our website if you want to find it if you're not familiar with it. So, okay, so just to make this point dramatically, if you sort of believe that the quality of teaching can be plotted along some kind of a curve, and a normal quote distribution is the frequency distribution of random events. I mean, let's remember what it is. But So who knows if this accurately portrays the quality of teaching, although based on the MET study, it does actually pretty well. And so one of the things that we have sort of, in general, all of us sort of in this world have concluded, and from the weight effect report and then subsequent studies, is we haven't yet got very good at doing this. So we could get better at just sort of figuring out who are our great teachers, who are not so good, how we, and then people who really need help. But even if we do that, that's not enough. We can get better at plotting the curve. We need to move the curve. We need to move. And so that then becomes our challenge for how to do it. So, okay. So let's just remember one thing. That when you define effective teaching, there's of course two basic approaches. One is to examine teaching practices. What do teachers, how well do they do the work of teaching? Now that's what my framework does. That's all it does. It does not attempt to examine the results of teaching, how well students learn. And that, of course, is where that is sucking all the air out of the room at the moment. And I can just tell you that, well, let me say a few things about this, and then I'm going to leave it. Let me just first of all say, I don't know a teacher or even a union activist who would argue that the second of these, that is the result side, is not relevant. And it's not an important indicator of effective teaching. Of course it is. It's why we do have schools, is for kids to learn, right? It's not like it's irrelevant. The challenge is to answer this question. What counts as evidence? And how can that evidence be attributed to an individual teacher? That's the challenge. And I will just have to tell you, I don't think there's anyone on the planet who's figured that out yet. But again, you all are much more expert than I on this. But I mean, talk about a common sense, test. I mean, let's suppose I teach fourth grade, and my test scores go up, and I'm happy, and the parents are happy, and the principal's happy. We're all happy. The only problem is we don't know if it was me. It might have been the reading teacher in the building. It might have been last year's teacher who taught these kids some strategies they just now figured out how to use. And as far as I can tell, there's no way to tease those things out. And I'd love to be enlightened if you have figured out ways to do it. But I do think the attribution problem is a real challenge. It's just a real challenge. I can't figure out how to answer it. But now, let's think about this in a little bit broader way. I mean, let's suppose I teach fourth grade, let's suppose she's my principal. I ought to be able to convince her that my kids have learned something this year. And we didn't just do pizza parties all year. But the question is the same. What counts as evidence? And how do we know it's attributable to me? Well, we ought to be able to figure that out. How about writing samples for September and May? You can think of evidence of student learning that would be linked to what I do as a teacher. And furthermore, that would engage the two of us in conversations we should be having about what do we have as evidence of student learning. So I don't think it's a bad question to ask. I'm skeptical that we actually yet have the tools to answer it. So, and that's what troubles me about making consequential decisions about teachers and their futures and their careers and their pay and their status if we don't have a really good system. So I'm hoping I'm wrong on this point. And I know there are a lot of smart people around the country working on it, and I really hope they do a good job because we need it. The public demands it, but we have to. It has to be fair to teachers. It just does. So anyhow, so I'm going to leave that for now because it's not my expertise, and you will, and certainly not in this room. So I'm going to leave the student learning part to you and others. And I just also, this slide is sort of in the wrong place. This should have been back a little bit earlier. This is a white paper that one of the people at ETS, Catherine McClellan, she was there at the time, and she was involved in a lot of the psychometric work for the MET study. And she did the bulk of the writing on this, and then Mark Atkinson at Teachscape and I contributed, he more than I, actually I contributed a very small part of this. But this, I mean, if you like this kind of thing, which I imagine you all do, I think it's written for practitioners, just so you know. not academics, but you might find it of value. It's on our website, and I'm not sure where else I can mention it. It's probably on TeachScapes and maybe ETS. I'm not sure. Do you know if it is, Stephen? I don't know.
I don't think it is, but it's definitely on your site and
it's on mine.
TeachScapes, yeah.
In any event. So, okay, so let's talk about the assessing effectiveness, teacher effectiveness around teacher practices. And I'd just like to read with you this quote from Lee Schulman. I'm a big admirer of Lee's, and let's just read it together because it's so good. He said, after 30 years of doing such work, I've concluded that classroom teaching is perhaps the most complex, most challenging, and most demanding, subtle, nuanced, and frightening, I love that word, activity our species has ever invented. The only time a physician could possibly encounter a situation of comparable complexity would be in the emergency room of a hospital during or after a natural disaster. I think that's great. And I actually think it's better than even he knew, in the sense that if you think of the work that doctors do, it is complex, there is no doubt about that. But you know something? They see their patients one at a time. We would call that tutoring. I mean, really, think about it. The minute you add a 7th student, or a 5th, or a 28, the complexity increases not just arithmetically, it's geometric. And so, okay, this is really demanding and challenging work, and teachers make hundreds, people don't actually count this, as you know, hundreds of decisions a day, often under what we have to call unfavorable circumstances, like in a hurry, or based on incomplete information. So the cognitive demand of teachers is significant. In other words, teaching is a thinking person's job, which has profound implications, by the way, for anyone who supports teachers in any capacity, whether it's coach, mentor, supervisor, university coach, that is if it's a student teacher, whatever. Because if we accept, and I think we have to, that teaching is, among other things, cognitive work, then the conversations we have about teaching must be about the cognition. How did you decide to do X rather than Y? Have you ever tried Y? What happened? Under what circumstances would you, and so on and so on, right? It's about the judgments that a teacher makes. And now, teaching is also demanding physical work. It's also very demanding emotional work. But we know for sure it's also challenging intellectual work. And that, I think, as a profession, we have learned fairly recently. And you can still today buy instruction materials that are sort of purport to be teacher-proof, right? Just do what it says here. Which, to me, if those can only be written by people who don't understand the cognitive complexity of teaching, I can't imagine how else you would come up with that. But it also highlights the challenge that many of us who appreciate the cognitive complexity of teaching have to also confront, as we have to then figure out ways to help teachers, improve that aspect of their teaching. It's not trivial. So any definition of teaching, therefore, has to respect this complexity. And when I came up with the framework, I tried to do that. And some of you may know it's got these 4 big domains. Now these are essentially the same 4 domains that were, it's an outgrowth of the Praxis 3 work. And they call them slightly different things and so on. It's the same basic construct. And then each of the domains is divided into either 5 or 6 components. And I'll just say a couple of things about this. First of all, the obvious, it's a framework for teaching. It's not a framework for school nurses, librarians, counselors. Those involve some teaching, but they involve a lot of other things too. And so they need their own frameworks. And in the second edition of the Enhancing Professional Practice framework book, I did actually include a chapter on non-classroom specialist positions that use the same architecture of the framework, except instead of calling it instruction, I called it delivery of service, whatever that was. In the case of, it's not the classroom environment, it's just the environment. It might be the library, it might be the nurse's office, it might be the workshop room, if it's an instructional coach, and so on. But the basic architecture of those non-classroom specialists is the same. So that's one perspective. Secondly, I'll just point out that domains 2 and 3 happen in the classroom, right? Domains 1 and 4 don't. They are behind the scenes work. They are almost certainly every bit as important to good teaching as domains 2 and 3, but you can't see them, which means that if you include them in an evaluation system, you need also to figure out what's the evidence. You're not going to be able to go much. You have to ask people to submit artifacts, typically, planning documents, or samples of how they communicate with families, or whatever it is that demonstrates their skill. Let's see. What else to say? Sometimes people look at these and they say, well, it's okay so far as it goes, but it's missing some things. Like it's incomplete. Where's technology? That's gone missing. Where's high expectations? There's a ton of research on that. Those are items that I call common themes. There are 7 of them. There might be more, actually, that I haven't yet identified, but I know there are these 7. And they are not included as components of teaching, not because they're not important. They are. They are. But the components of the framework represent the work of teaching. That is what teachers do. The common themes reflect the manner in which they do what they do. So, for example, you could pick any one, say high expectations. If a teacher held high expectations for student learning, where would you see it? Where would it turn up? Well, they would set outcomes at a high level. This is what they would, anyway, in domain 1, setting instructional outcomes, those would be at a challenging level. The questions that a teacher frames would be at a challenging level. The feedback they give would be on the assumption of high level, or as with the communication with families. That is, the common themes, they all interact with several of the components, not all of them, but several. So, but this is a very interesting conversation to have with teachers. So let's take technology. Which ones of these components would be enhanced through the effective use and appropriate use of technology? Well, not all of them, but quite a few. And the question then is not only which ones, but how. How? In what manner would that impact develop? And so that then becomes a very interesting professional conversation, and I would urge you to have it if you have that opportunity. Okay. Let me mention one other thing. This is not rocket science. Would never do this. It's written down common sense, and if it doesn't pass the common sense test for somebody, then they should decide whether or not it's right for them. But it is grounded in some assumptions, and any such framework is. I just made them explicit, and I've already told you the underlying assumption about teaching, that is, that it is challenging cognitive work. There are also some assumptions about learning, student learning. And the main one is this, and I even hesitate to say this because it sounds so obvious and sort of dumb, but I am going to say it, which is, cognitive psychologists don't agree on everything. They do agree on this, that learning is done by the learner through an active intellectual process, period, full stop. Now, it seems so obvious why even bother to say it, except it's easy we tend to overlook it. Learning is done by the learner, which then has profound implications. That is, when I observe in a class, of course I care what the teacher's doing. It is a framework for teaching everything, right? But I really care what the students are doing. What is the nature of the task? What's the cognitive demand? What are we asking them to do? How are we engaging them intellectually? So what that then means is that the heart of the framework is actually buried. It's in domain 3. It's engaging students in learning. That is the centerpiece, and everything we could argue. Domain 4 has some sort of independent things, but domains 1, 2, and 3 are all in support of student engagement. They just are. Now, one of the places this plays out is actually in domain 2, the culture for learning. Now that is sort of looks innocent enough, and I'd just like to, in 2 sentences, explain what that is. Well, I'll just start with a little observation. I don't know about you. I have never known an intellectually lazy 4-year-old. I mean, think about the 4-year-olds, right? I mean, I've known a lot of intellectually lazy 14-year-olds. Now, granted, a lot goes on between 4 and 14, but one of the things that happens is they go to school. And I would hate to think that we in schools contribute to switching off the lights. But I think we better take a good look at that. I mean, the Met study involved 23,000 lessons. Now, I didn't watch all 23,000, but I watched quite a few. And you know, when a kid says, well, when you ask a kid who doesn't like school, why not? Have you ever heard one say that it's because it's too hard? I don't think I have. What do they say? Well, they don't know this. And when they say it's boring, you know what? They are sometimes right. As I say, I watched a lot of these Met videos, and a lot of it's pretty boring. If you've ever shadowed a student in school, that's a frightening experience. Because they, anyway, I'm not going to belabor that point, but the point is, though, that a lot of it is pretty boring and not very intellectually engaging, and it's watch me while I show you how to do something, or, you know. And so it's just not been part of our culture of teaching. And so that's what the culture for learning is about. It's about the energy, the intellectual energy on both the teacher and the student's part in whatever. And so it's not in domain 3 because it's not about teaching specific content. It's about the culture, but it's about its energy around learning. So I won't belabor that. But let me just say one more thing. Think of a kid, and I'm thinking probably a 12-year-old boy, but it could be anybody, learning to ride a skateboard. Now, you don't have to drive them to keep at it, right? I mean, they are at it, and it's getting dark outside, and they're still, working at it, and they risk and sometimes endure physical injury, just to get good at that. Now, why? Well, they get bragging rights with their friends, sure. I would also argue that the mastery of that complex physical skill is enormously gratifying and satisfying. I would also argue that the mastery of a complex intellectual skill is also enormously satisfying and gratifying. And I think we have to figure out ways in schools to make fractions a little bit more like skateboarding. Right? That is the understanding of a complex concept. That's hard. And yet, we don't treat it as a challenge that that is really satisfying. And so, this framework is grounded in that sort of a view and a vision of schooling and learning and energy and intellectual engagement, cognitive engagement. And so that's okay. One last thing. I wouldn't want you or anybody to think that because these aspects of teaching are listed out separately, they're described separately, I wouldn't let you think that I think that teachers do them separately. No, of course not. And you can illustrate that actually pretty easily. Pick anyone, like say in domain 3, the second one is questioning and discussions techniques. If a teacher were really good at that, what else in this framework would that same teacher have to be good at also in order to be good at that? They'd have to know their content, right? They'd have to know their students. What's an appropriate question for this group or this individual? They would have to have clear outcomes. If I'm running a discussion, I ought to have some idea of what I want the kids to learn from this discussion. So I have clear outcomes. There would be an environment of respect and therefore where it's a safe environment for kids to take risks. There would be this culture for learning. There would be procedures. Do you raise your hand? Do you not? And so on.